There is a different world that awakens when the sun goes down. It exists on the long, lonely stretches of asphalt that connect the sleeping cities of America. This is the world of the night-haul trucker. It's a world of profound solitude where the only companions are the drone of a diesel engine, the hypnotic dance of the white lines, and the vast, impenetrable darkness pressing in on all sides. In the dead of night, the road becomes a liminal space. The familiar landmarks of the day dissolve into monstrous shapes, and the mind, weary from hours of driving, becomes susceptible to the strange and the unsettling. Every flicker of light, every shadow in the periphery, can become a source of dread. For most drivers, these are just tricks of the eye, phantoms of fatigue, but not always. Today, we journey into that oppressive darkness. We're sharing 3 true, harrowing accounts from truckers who were alone on the road in the deepest hours of the night, and who encountered something that defied explanation and instilled a terror that the daylight could not erase. These are the stories that are born when the world is asleep, and the only witness is a lone driver, miles from anywhere, staring into the abyss. Story 1. The Figure in the Rain. Our first story comes from a driver we'll call Frank, a man who hauled refrigerated goods, reefers, up and down the East Coast in the late 1990s. Frank was a no-nonsense veteran driver who prided himself on his professionalism and his ability to handle anything the road threw at him. He was used to the punishing schedules, the bad weather, and the loneliness of the night shift. But one rain-lashed night on a desolate stretch of I-95 in rural South Carolina, he came face to face with something that wasn't on any map, a horror that the pouring rain couldn't wash away. It was just after 2 a.m. A relentless, torrential downpour had been hammering the coast for hours. The rain was so heavy, it was overwhelming his wipers, turning the world outside his windshield into a blurry, chaotic mess of reflected light and impenetrable darkness. The highway was nearly deserted. Most sane drivers had already pulled over to wait out the storm, but Frank had a critical load of perishable medical supplies that had to make it to a hospital in Miami. He pushed on, his big rig a lone ship on a black asphalt ocean. The constant, deafening roar of the rain on his cab and the rhythmic slap of the wipers had a hypnotic effect. He was fighting to stay focused, his eyes straining to pick out the lane markers in the deluge. It was in this state of intense, weary concentration that he saw it. Up ahead, caught in the sweeping glare of his headlights, was a figure. It was standing in the middle of the right lane directly in his path. Frank's heart leaped into his throat. His first reaction was a surge of adrenaline and anger. A person, standing in the middle of the interstate in a storm this bad in the dead of night. It was a death wish. He laid on his air horn, a deafening blast that should have sent any living creature scrambling for safety. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there, a dark, motionless silhouette against the blinding rain. Frank was forced to react. He couldn't stop his 80,000-pound rig in time on the slick road. He yanked the wheel, his trailer groaning in protest, as he swerved into the left lane to avoid the collision. As he passed, he got a fleeting, nightmarish glimpse of the figure. It was a man, tall and unnaturally thin. He was wearing what looked like an old, dark, rain-soaked suit, but his head was bare, his face turned towards Frank's truck as it thundered past, and on his face, in that split-second glimpse, was a smile. It was a wide, unnatural, predatory grin, a slash of white in the darkness that was utterly devoid of humor or humanity. Frank's blood ran cold. The image of that terrible smile was burned into his mind. He looked in his rear-view mirror, expecting to see the figure illuminated by his taillights, but there was nothing. Just the pouring rain and the empty road. It was as if the man had simply vanished the moment he passed. Shaken, Frank tried to rationalize it. It was a mannequin, maybe, a sick prank, or a hallucination, a highway ghost conjured by his tired mind and the distorted view through the rain-streaked glass. He had been on the road for over 12 hours. It was possible. He took a few deep breaths, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and focused on the road ahead. He drove for another 5 minutes, the image of the smiling man refusing to fade. He was just starting to convince himself it had been a trick of the light when he saw it again. Up ahead, in the middle of the right lane, stood the figure. It was impossible. He was miles down the road. There was no way anyone could have gotten ahead of him. Yet, there he was. The same tall, thin silhouette. The same dark suit, standing perfectly still in the pouring rain. This time, Frank didn't hesitate. He stayed in the left lane, his foot heavy on the accelerator. He was not going to swerve. He was not going to stop. He was going to drive past and pretend it wasn't there. As he drew level with the figure, he forced himself not to look. He stared straight ahead, his heart hammering against his ribs. But in his peripheral vision, he could see the man's head turn to follow him, and he could feel the weight of that terrible, wide grin. The moment he was past, he risked a glance in the mirror. Gone. Vanished into the rain as if he were made of smoke. This was not a prank. This was not a hallucination. A cold, creeping dread, far worse than simple fear, began to seep into Frank's bones. This was something else. Something that didn't follow the rules of the physical world. He felt like he was being hunted, toyed with by something that saw the highway as its own personal playground. He grabbed his CB radio, desperate to hear another human voice to confirm he wasn't going insane. "Breaker 19, any drivers on I-95 southbound, around mile marker 40, he called out, his voice strained. The radio crackled, but there was no response. The storm was likely interfering with the signal. He was completely, utterly alone. He knew he had to get off this road. The next exit was for a small, forgotten town called Kusawachi, little more than a gas station and a rundown motel. It wasn't a place he would ever normally stop, but tonight it felt like the only sanctuary in the world. The exit was 5 miles away. He just had to make it 5 more miles. He watched the road ahead with a terrifying intensity, his eyes scanning for any sign of the figure. The rain continued its relentless assault. The world outside was a churning vortex of black and gray. 1 mile passed, then 2, then 3. There was no sign of the man. A sliver of hope began to dawn in Frank's mind. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had given up. He was on the 4th mile, the exit sign just visible through the deluge, when his engine sputtered. It coughed once, twice, and then died. The roar of the diesel was replaced by a sudden, deafening silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. The truck coasted to a stop, its lights flickering and then extinguishing, plunging him into an almost total darkness. His rig was dead. In all his years of driving, his truck had never once broken down like this. Not once. Frank sat there in the dark, paralyzed by terror so profound it was almost sublime. This was not a coincidence. The breakdown here, now. It was deliberate. It was part of the game. He was a mouse in a trap, and the cat was coming to play. He fumbled in the darkness for his mag light, its heavy, metal form a small comfort in his trembling hand. He peered through the windshield, but he could see nothing but his own terrified reflection in the glass. He was afraid to turn on his hazard lights, afraid to do anything that might announce his presence, even though he knew with a chilling certainty that the thing out there knew exactly where he was. He waited in the suffocating silence. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every drop of rain on the roof sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. His mind was a canvas, and fear was painting its masterpiece. Then he heard a new sound. A soft, slow, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the back of his trailer. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a single finger tapping patiently on the metal door of his reefer unit. Frank's breath hitched in his throat. The figure was no longer on the road. It was at his truck. It was inspecting its catch. The tapping slowly, methodically, moved up the side of the trailer. It was a leisurely sound, the sound of something with all the time in the world. Frank sat frozen in his cab, listening as the taps grew closer. They reached the cab. They moved along the passenger side. He could hear the odd, faint tink, tink, tink as it tapped on the fuel tank, then the door. The tapping stopped right at the passenger side window, just a few feet from where he sat. He held his breath, his eyes glued to the dark window, expecting to see that terrible, smiling face materialize out of the rain. But there was nothing. Just darkness. A moment of silence. Then, the handle of the passenger side door jiggled. It was a soft, testing jiggle at first. Then it became more forceful. The handle rattled violently, the sound unnaturally loud in the small, dark cab. Frank let out an involuntary cry. He had locked the doors. He knew he had locked them, but in his panic, he couldn't be sure. He scrambled across the cab, his hand closing over the lock on the passenger door, pushing it down with all his might, even though it was already locked. The rattling continued, a frantic, violent shaking, as if a wild animal were trying to get in. The entire truck seemed to rock with the force of it, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing Frank had ever experienced. He stayed pressed against the passenger door, his body trembling, listening. He waited for the sound of the glass breaking, for the figure to appear at his own window, but there was nothing. Just the steady, relentless drumming of the rain. He stayed like that for over an hour, a statue carved from fear, until the first, faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the clouds. As the darkness receded, so did his terror, replaced by a shaky, adrenaline-fueled exhaustion. The rain softened to a drizzle. In the growing light, he could see the road was empty. He cautiously tried the ignition. The engine, which had been completely dead, roared to life on the first try. The lights flickered on. Everything was normal. Frank didn't wait. He drove the last mile to the Kusawachi exit and pulled into the dingy gas station, his hands still shaking. He got out of his truck, needing to see it in the light, to assure himself it had all been a nightmare. The truck was fine. There were no scratches, no dents. But when he looked at the passenger side door, his heart stopped for the final time. The entire door, from the window down to the running board, was covered in long, deep, parallel scratches, as if something with claws had been trying to tear its way through the metal. And on the window itself, perfectly preserved in the grime and condensation, was a single, clear handprint. It was too long and slender to be human, with fingers that were impossibly, unnaturally thin. Frank sold his rig and quit the industry that week. He never drove a truck at night again. He had come to understand that some things own the darkness, and the rain is just a curtain for the stage. He had survived his encounter with the figure in the rain, but it had taken something from him. His sense of safety, his belief in a rational world, and his ability to ever again feel truly alone on a dark and empty road. Story 2. The radio out of time. The high plains of West Texas are a lonely place. It's a vast, flat expanse of scrubland and oil fields under a sky so big it can make a person feel utterly insignificant. For a trucker, crossing this part of the country at night is a journey into a profound and almost unnerving silence. Our second story comes from this world, from a driver named Carter, a young man who, in 2014, was hauling drilling equipment from Midland to a remote site near the New Mexico border. It was on this dark, empty stretch of road that he tuned into a radio broadcast that wasn't just from another place, but from another time. Carter was only a few years into his trucking career, but he was already accustomed to the solitude. He preferred the night shift. The roads were empty, the air was cool, and there was a sense of peace he couldn't find during the chaotic daylight hours. On this particular night, the sky was clear and moonless, a black velvet canopy dusted with a brilliant spray of stars. The only light for miles in any direction came from his own headlights, cutting a lonely tunnel through the darkness. His satellite radio had lost its signal about an hour ago, a common occurrence in this part of the country. The silence, usually a comfort, was starting to feel oppressive. He decided to scan the old AM radio band, hoping to pick up one of the powerful border blaster stations from Mexico, or maybe a late-night talk show. He turned the dial, the radio emitting a cascade of static whistles and faint, ghostly snippets of sound. He was about to give up when he landed on something. It was faint at first, buried deep in the static, but it was definitely a broadcast. It was music. Old music, a style he vaguely recognized from his grandparents' records. A big band orchestra with swinging brass and a smooth, crooning male vocalist. Carter frowned. It was a strange thing to find on the radio in 2014, especially in the middle of nowhere. Most AM stations at this hour were either automated classic rock, religious programming, or syndicated talk shows. This felt different. It felt authentic. There was a warm, slightly tinny quality to the sound, a faint crackle that wasn't from the static but seemed to be part of the recording itself, like an old vinyl record. As he listened, the song ended and a new voice came on the air. It was an announcer, his voice a smooth, deep baritone with the kind of polished, mid-Atlantic accent you only hear in old black-and-white movies. And that was the incomparable Glenn Miller with In the Mood, the announcer said warmly. You're listening to KSKY, broadcasting live from the Starlight Ballroom in beautiful downtown Dallas. It's a wonderful Saturday night here, folks, and the dance floor is just packed. We'll be right back with more music after a word from our sponsor, Blue Ribbon Beer. Carter felt a chill crawl up his spine. KSKY. He'd never heard of it. And live from the Starlight Ballroom in Dallas? Dallas was over 300 miles away. It was possible to pick up a signal from that far at night, but a live broadcast from a ballroom dance on a Tuesday night? The announcer had said it was Saturday. He dismissed it as a pre-recorded nostalgia show, a syndicated program designed to sound like an old-time radio broadcast. It was a clever gimmick. He kept listening, intrigued. A commercial played for Blue Ribbon Beer, the jingle sounding cheerful and ridiculously out of date. Then the announcer returned. And we're back, live from the Starlight Ballroom, he crooned. What a night it is, folks. The stars are out, the mood is right, and the whole city is buzzing. It feels like the whole world is holding its breath tonight, doesn't it? A feeling of great anticipation in the air. Now, let's get back to the music with the lovely Helen Forrest, and I've heard that song before. The music started up again, another classic big band tune. But the announcer's words stuck in Carter's head. The whole world is holding its breath tonight. It was such a strange, specific thing to say. It sounded like something more than just a description of a lively Saturday night. It sounded portentous. Carter was a bit of a history buff. He pulled out his smartphone, he still had a bar or two of service, and did a quick search. KSKY Radio Dallas. The results made his blood run cold. KSKY was a real station in Dallas, but it had gone off the air in the 1950s. He searched for the Starlight Ballroom. It had been a real place, too, a popular dance hall in Dallas. It had burned to the ground in 1968. His hands felt numb. He was listening to a radio station that hadn't existed for over 50 years, broadcasting live from a ballroom that had turned to ash before he was born. He kept listening, now completely captivated, a knot of fear and fascination tightening in his stomach. The music played on, song after song, each one a ghost from a forgotten era. In between songs, the announcer would talk, his smooth voice a strange comfort and a source of growing dread. He never mentioned a date, but his language was filled with clues. He talked about the boys overseas and the importance of buying war bonds. He made a joke about rationing. Carter did another search. Glenn Miller, Helen Forrest, war bonds, rationing. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. This wasn't just any old broadcast. This was a broadcast from the World War II era, sometime in the early 1940s. He was listening to a radio signal that was 70 years old. How was this possible? A solar flare? A strange atmospheric condition bouncing a long dead signal back to Earth? Or was it something else? Was he somehow tuning into the past? The thought was insane, but the evidence was undeniable. The music, the announcer, the historical references, it was all too perfect. The broadcast continued. The announcer's tone began to shift subtly. The cheerful, upbeat energy started to fade, replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety. "It's getting late, folks," the announcer said, his voice a little less smooth now. "But the crowd here at the Starlight Ballroom isn't going anywhere." There's a tension in the air tonight, a feeling that this night is special, a night that people will remember for a long, long time. We're all waiting for news. We're hoping for the best, but, well, let's not dwell on that. Let's have another tune from the orchestra. The music that followed was slower, more melancholic, a ballad filled with a sense of longing and loss. Carter felt like he was a ghost, eavesdropping on a moment of history, a room full of people dancing and laughing on the edge of some great, unknown precipice. What were they waiting for? What news were they expecting? He did one last search, combining all the clues. KSK Radio, Starlight Ballroom, war bonds, and the phrase that had stuck with him, a night that people will remember. The search results loaded, and Carter had to pull his truck over onto the shoulder, his breath catching in his chest. He stared at the screen, at the historical articles and archives that appeared. He was listening to the night of June 5th, 1944, the night before D-Day. The news they were waiting for was the announcement of the Allied invasion of Normandy. The boys overseas were the hundreds of thousands of soldiers about to storm the beaches of France. The world wasn't just holding its breath. It was on the brink of one of the most pivotal and bloody moments in human history. The people in that ballroom were dancing and celebrating, completely unaware that in a few short hours, thousands of young men would be dead. A profound, crushing sadness washed over Carter. He was listening to the last moments of peace, the final, innocent hours of a world that was about to change forever. The voices and the music were not just echoes. They were ghosts, frozen in time, forever dancing on the eve of destruction. He listened to the rest of the broadcast, which lasted for another hour. The announcer's voice grew more and more strained. The music became more frantic, more desperate. The party was trying to hold back the dawn, to hold back the inevitable news. The final song was a hauntingly beautiful, slow ballad. As the last notes faded away, the announcer came on one last time. His voice was no longer smooth or cheerful. It was heavy with a weary, sorrowful resignation. "This is KSKY, signing off from the Starlight Ballroom," he said softly. "It's been a wonderful evening. To all our listeners, and to the boys, wherever they may be tonight, good luck, and good night." The broadcast didn't end with static. It just stopped. The silence that filled Carter's cab was more profound and empty than any silence he had ever known. He sat there on the side of the dark Texas highway for a long time, the weight of what he had heard pressing down on him. He had been a witness to a moment of history in the most impossible way imaginable. He had heard the voices of ghosts, broadcast across 70 years of time, a final, poignant message from a world on the brink. He tried to find the station again later that night and on subsequent trips, but he never could. It was gone. A once-in-a-lifetime fluke, a tear in the fabric of time that had allowed him to listen in on a single, fateful night. The experience changed Carter. The solitude of the road no longer felt peaceful. It felt thin. He felt like he was driving through a world filled with echoes, with moments of the past that were still playing out just beyond the range of our senses. He had learned that the dead of night was not just dark, but old, and that sometimes, if you tune the dial just right, you can hear the voices of those who are lost in time. Story 3. The Weight on the Axles. The final story is a modern one, from 2019, and it comes from a driver named Maria. Maria was a rare breed in the trucking industry, a solo female driver who specialized in heavy-haul, oversized loads. Her job was to transport massive, often bizarrely shaped pieces of equipment, wind turbine blades, industrial machinery, even sections of houses, on specialized, multi-axle trailers. It was a high-stress, high-skill job that required meticulous planning and nerves of steel. Maria was one of the best. She was tough, pragmatic, and not easily spooked. But one starless night in the desolate, rolling hills of eastern Montana, she picked up a load that wasn't on her manifest, a terrifying, unseen weight that threatened to drag her into oblivion. Maria's journey began at a manufacturing plant in North Dakota. Her cargo was a gigantic, custom-built pressure vessel for a new oil refinery, a colossal steel cylinder that weighed over 100,000 pounds. The route was carefully planned to avoid low bridges and tight turns, taking her through some of the most remote and sparsely populated parts of the country. Because of the superload permits, she was required to travel almost exclusively at night, often with a pilot car escort. On this particular night, however, she was on a long, straight stretch of a 2-lane state highway where no escort was required. It was around 1 a.m. The landscape was a vast, undulating sea of darkness, the rolling hills visible only as slightly blacker shapes against the black sky. She was completely alone. The last pilot car had turned off an hour ago, and the next one wasn't scheduled to meet her for another 50 miles. The only sounds were the deep, powerful roar of her specialized Kenworth truck and the low hum of the wind. She was climbing a long, gradual incline when she first felt it. A subtle change in the way the truck was handling. It felt heavy, heavier than it should. Maria knew her truck and her load intimately. She knew exactly how it should feel on a 3% grade. This was different. It felt sluggish, bogged down, as if she were dragging an immense, unseen anchor. Her eyes immediately went to her gauges. Engine temperature was normal. Oil pressure was fine. But the pyrometer, which measures exhaust gas temperature, was climbing. The engine was working harder than it should be, straining against the mysterious weight. Her first thought was a mechanical problem, a dragging brake on the trailer perhaps, or an issue with the transmission. She pulled over on the wide shoulder at the crest of the hill, the silence of the prairie rushing in as she killed the engine. She grabbed her high-powered flashlight and began a thorough inspection. She spent the next half hour meticulously checking every component of her rig. She checked the brakes on all 9 of her trailer's axles. None were engaged. She checked the tires. All were properly inflated. She checked the hydraulics, the air lines, the chains and binders securing the massive tank. Everything was perfect. There was absolutely no mechanical reason for the truck to feel so heavy. Confused and a little unnerved, she climbed back into the cab. She chalked it up to a strange headwind or a miscalculation of the grade. She started the engine and pulled back onto the empty highway. The moment she was back on the road, the feeling returned, stronger this time. The truck felt like it was driving through thick mud. It was an immense physical drag, a palpable resistance that had no source. She had to give the engine far more throttle than usual just to maintain speed on the flat terrain. The pyrometer climbed again, a clear sign that the engine was under a severe, unexplained strain. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach. This wasn't right. In the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere, the last thing a driver wants is for their truck to behave in an unpredictable way. Her rig was her lifeline. Its reliability was all she had. She was contemplating pulling over again when she saw something in her driver's side mirror. The mirror was angled down, giving her a clear view of her trailer's rear axles and the road behind her. In the glow of her own tail lights, she saw a flicker of movement. She stared into the mirror, her heart starting to pound. She saw it again. A dark shape, low to the ground, moving near the rear wheels of her trailer. It was indistinct, a blur of motion in the red glow. Her first thought was an animal, a coyote or a large dog that had somehow gotten caught up under the trailer. She slowed the truck, hoping the animal would run off, but the shape didn't run. Instead, it seemed to resolve itself. It was not an animal. It was a person, or at least it was shaped like a person. It was crouched on the asphalt, its hands on the rearmost axle of her trailer, as if it were physically holding on, dragging its feet on the road. Maria's mind reeled. She blinked, shaking her head, convinced she was seeing things. She looked again. The figure was still there, a dark, humanoid, shape clinging to the back of her trailer, its form distorted by the heat haze from the tires. And then another one appeared, and another. Within seconds, she could see them clearly in both her side mirrors. There were dozens of them, dark, shadowy figures, all crouched low to the ground, their hands gripping the axles, the frame, any part of the trailer they could reach. They were like a pack of ghouls, their bodies being dragged along the highway, their feet scraping on the asphalt. And they were all pulling back, a silent collective force, trying to stop her truck. This was the weight. This was the drag. Maria let out a terrified gasp. This was impossible. It was a nightmare. She was hallucinating. She had to be. She floored the accelerator. The engine screamed in protest, the pyrometers shooting into the red zone, but the truck barely gained any speed. It was like trying to drive through a sea of invisible concrete. She could see the figures more clearly now. They were emaciated, their forms skeletal, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were not solid. Their edges seemed to shimmer and dissolve into the darkness, like smoke or heat haze. They were not casting shadows. They were things of shadow. She grabbed her CB mic, her hands shaking so violently she could barely key it. "Mayday! Mayday, I need help," she stammered, her voice a choked whisper. "There are people. They're holding onto my truck. I'm on Highway 12, about 20 miles east of Forsyth." The radio was silent. There was no one else out here. No one to hear her. The truck was slowing down, despite the engine roaring at maximum power. The drag was becoming overwhelming. She looked in the mirrors again. The figures were no longer just clinging to the trailer. They were starting to climb. She watched in abject horror as the shadowy forms began to pull themselves up onto the flatbed deck, moving with a terrifying insect-like agility. They swarmed over her precious cargo, their dark shapes crawling over the massive steel tank. They were moving toward the cab. One of them reached the front of the trailer. It stood up, silhouetted against the faint glow of her cab lights. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely humanoid shape made of pure, roiling darkness. It took a step, moving from the trailer onto the narrow space behind her cab. Maria screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. She yanked the steering wheel, swerving violently from side to side, trying to shake them off. The massive rig fish-tailed wildly on the narrow road, the tires screeching in protest. The figures clung on, unaffected by the violent motion. The figure behind her cab took another step, its shadowy hand reaching for the cab door. In a final, desperate act, Maria hit the trailer brake lever, the trolley brake. It was a dangerous move that locked up only the trailer's wheels, a maneuver that could easily cause a catastrophic jackknife. But she had no other choice. The trailer brakes locked with a deafening screech. The entire rig shuddered violently, the trailer trying to overtake the cab. The shadowy figures were thrown from their perches, their forms scattering across the highway like leaves in a storm. For a split second, her mirrors were filled with a vortex of swirling black shapes. And then, they were gone. The truck jackknifed, the cab spinning around to face the trailer in a shower of sparks and tortured metal. It slid to a halt, blocking both lanes of the highway. The engine stalled, the world plunged back into silence. Maria sat there, trembling, sobbing, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel. She had survived. She didn't know how, but she had survived. It took her nearly an hour to get the courage to move. She restarted the truck, and through a series of complex, difficult maneuvers, managed to get the rig untangled and straightened out. She inspected the truck again. There were no scratches, no dents, no physical evidence of the figures at all. But the rear tires of her trailer were worn down, shredded as if they had been dragged for miles against a rough, abrasive surface. She finished her route, delivering the load in a state of profound shock. She reported the jackknife as a mechanical failure, a locked brake. She couldn't tell the truth. Who would believe her? Maria completed her contract and then quit Heavy Haul for good. The memory of that night was too much to bear. She never learned what those things were. Were they ghosts, demons, the hungry spirits of the empty prairie? She only knows that they were real, that they had weight and substance, and that they had tried to drag her and a truck down into their own dark world. She had felt their strength, a collective malevolence that had almost overpowered her 600-horsepower engine. A terrifying reminder that in the dead of night, on a lonely road, you are sometimes hauling more than just the cargo on your manifest.